Good morning, St. Mo's. It is good to be with you today. If you haven't already read our teaching text for today, you can just press pause on me and read Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 23. Today I'm going to mix it up on you and suggest that you read that in the NIV version. You can just Google Colossians 1:15-23 and the letters NIV and read that. And then once you've read that, you can just press play again. I want to begin this morning by asking you to take a moment and ask yourself this. What recently has given you hope? Is it news that Lamar Jackson is 100% again after his training camp injury? Is it maybe the day that you check the Hopkins COVID dashboard and see that finally in the area you're checking the numbers are plateauing? Is it the opportunity to spend a few precious hours face to face with a loved one when just for that moment it seems like all is right in the world? Hope is powerful. It can totally transform situations. I remember as a little kid climbing way up into a beech tree that was down the road from my parents' house. And I grew up climbing trees, but this time I climbed higher than I'd ever been before, and I got way beyond my comfort zone. And when I looked down to start climbing down, I felt like I couldn't see the next branch, or the next branch down was too far from me, and I froze. My older brother ran home and got my mom, and when she came, she wasn't particularly pleased with the pickle that I'd gotten myself into, but the moment I heard her voice and began to focus on her instructions guiding me down the tree, I was confident that if I listened to her voice, listened to her instructions, and took one little step down at a time, that I would make it back to the ground and back to a spanking. Just kidding about that part. For the next few weeks, we are taking a look at our core values: hope, hospitality, and holiness. We do this each year, both because these core values are representative of what we want to become as a community, and also because they help us to take stock of where we are, to take a look at our progress and what progress we still need to make. More of that later. But each year, taking a look at our core values also allows us to gather as a community around these, because these are the values that we are gathering around when we become members of St. Mo's. Joining St. Mo's, which you'll have the opportunity to do in a few weeks, is quite different from, say, signing up for Amazon Prime or Netflix, because where those subscriptions quietly renew month to month and year to year, so that you forget that they're actually requiring anything of you, we want to be upfront. Being part of this church requires something of you. It's asking you to push all in. It's asking you to invest your time, to invest your treasure, to learn, to lead, to encourage, to throw yourself into the life of this community. And so effectively, every year we cancel membership. Everybody is off the books, and if you want to join, you have to opt in again. This keeps our commitment to Christ and to each other fresh and forefront each year. So let's jump into the first of our core values today: hope. I'm in my 30s, and with every graying beard hair, it feels like I'm just hurtling toward that stage when we're all meant to have midlife crises. Jill and I were joking the other day about motorcycles, and the kids overheard, and I had to explain to them what a midlife crisis was. And as I was reflecting on that, it seemed to me that could describe our entire culture. It's like, even though we aren't explicitly asking the question, who am I and who are we really, if the old adage that actions speak louder than words is true, we are, as a culture, asking that question: who are we really? What does it mean to be a human being at level 100? I came across an article in Psychology Today. It's actually a decade old now, from a columnist, Mel Schwartz. And he spelled out exactly what I think we are seeing in our culture. Just to be clear, he offered it as advice, and I'm offering it as cultural commentary. This is what Mel Schwartz said June 6th, back in 2010. This question, the question of who am I, asked so often suggests that there is actually a plausible answer, almost as if our being were a fixed thing. People who ask this sort of question are typically struggling with their identity and are searching for a core sense of themselves. The irony, he says, is that the more you seek to identify who you are, the more fragile you are likely to feel about yourself. There may be an inverse correlation between the question being asked and the ease with which you experience your life, as if ease were our goal. The emphasis, he goes on to say, shouldn't be on discovering who you are, what is buried beneath, but on facilitating the emergence of what you'd like to experience. I'll say that last bit again. The emphasis shouldn't be on discovering who you are, but on facilitating the emergence of what you'd like to experience. Aren't we seeing that? Like the cultural level quest for identity pursued through the emergence of desired experience. It used to be that billboards of leather-faced Marlboro men and glossy magazine covers of elegantly dressed and bejeweled women, they stoked our imaginations of what we wanted to own. But now, our timelines and feeds are filled with lifestyle influencers who are cultivating our appetites toward what we want to experience. So mine are always saying essentially, quit your job, Ian, get a tiny house, one on wheels, big wheels that can go off-road, travel the planet, experience life to the full. Or, coming from a different angle, think about the fully immersive alternate reality role-playing video games. Experience life for a few hours without the limitations of your real life. This shapes the way we think about who we are. Or consider the relevance today of Ralph Ellison's 1952 novel, The Invisible Man. The poignantly nameless narrator navigates the dehumanizing ambiguities of being a black man under Jim Crow. Many of you know intimately the experience of navigating a world built for the advantage of a different group of people. You know the conscious and unconscious adaptations and even sublimations that has entailed for you. Or consider the once peripheral but now mainstream conversation about transhumanism. This Neil Harbison's surgically implanted Wi-Fi enabled antenna. Is that pointing the way forward for all of humanity adapting to our changing environment, or is that some sort of transgression of a sacred boundary? We are collectively and individually with increasing urgency asking the question, who are we and what does it mean to be human? And I want to suggest that being a community of hope means that at St. Mo's we are pursuing the one picture we have of truly flourished humanity. We're holding on to and holding out the one picture we have of the perfect human. Did you know that picture is in Scripture for us? Look at the way Colossians 1:15 puts it. It says, the Son, meaning Jesus, is the image of the invisible God. He's the firstborn over all creation. If you've been around St. Mo's for more than a few weeks, you will have heard me talk about how all of us, humans, women and men, are made by God in His image. And of course, the ancient backdrop for that is that is temples. So if you were to, say, walk into a 7th century BC temple in Babylon, you'd see an image in that temple, probably something made out of wood or stone and overlaid with an expensive metal. And those ancient people, it's not like they believed that the image itself was a god. They believed that those images were visible representatives of an invisible reality. Humans, the ancients by and large believed, were slaves, were to be slaves, and their function was to provide food or sex or slave labor for the gods or other provide things for the gods. And because those gods were invisible, the humans had to provide those things to the visible representatives. The Bible's radically ennobling and democratizing claim then is that we, each of us, human beings, are images of God. It's not just emperors, it's not just pharaohs. Each of us are little visual representatives of the one true invisible God. So then what Colossians is saying is that Jesus, the Christ, the long-awaited Messiah, is the archetype of all images. We are images of God. He is the image of God. So think of it this way. Before God ever created a human being in his image, putting his life into corpuscles and craniums, before he ever did that, there was a first image, Christ. The Jesus who left footprints in the dust of ancient first century Palestine. He was the original image, as it were, now come among the image bearers. The invisible God, now fully visible among humans as a human. So think about that. That means when we open our Bibles and gaze on the life of Jesus that we have portrayed for us there in the four tellings, the four biographies of Jesus in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what we see is the model of true humanity. Not in a wooden sense, like we each need to become a first century Middle Eastern man, but in the expansive, life-orienting sense. So think about Jesus' life. Instead of laboring to feed God, he delighted to call God Father and to nurture this intimacy with God. Instead of climbing high and fast at the expense of all the others around him, Jesus took off his robe and scrubbed the dirt from the feet of others as an act of love and of leadership. Instead of simply amassing wealth for his own use, for his own satisfaction, instead, Jesus took care of the needs of those around him. Instead of responding in aggression to his enemies, Jesus lovingly and selflessly laid down his life. Instead of succumbing to karoshi, death by overwork, Jesus embraced real human limitations of rest, of solitude, alongside of work and engagement. The perfect human being living perfectly in his own context. So one of the most deeply hopeful truths that we Christians incubate and hold on to in our own context is the life of Jesus as the picture of true humanity. We know the one who made the invisible God visible as a human being. We're not left floundering when it comes to the question, who are we and what does it look like to be a flourishing human being? Next to the question of identity is the question of purpose. What are we here for? I know a bunch of you college students have just graduated or are headed into your senior year and you're thinking about, what does the rest of my life look like? What is my career going to be? For the first time in modern history, a majority of young people now are embarking on their vocational years fully within what the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor would call the immanent frame. It's a world that has virtually no belief in a transcendent reality. So it's like our world is a bedroom with the curtains drawn, and we've lost any sense of the rest of the house, let alone the world outside. Only here and there we see little vestiges, little memories of an outside world, like a kite lying unused in the corner. We bump into these little vestiges of a time back when people believed in a reality that was enveloping ours and beyond ours. For instance, the word vocation comes from the Latin word vocatio, meaning being called. Lives lived in response to an invitation that comes to us from beyond us. It was Alistair MacIntyre, the Scottish philosopher, who famously said, "I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part?" So here's the question for you. What's the story your life is part of? Does it begin here in Baltimore? Does it begin in a different place and move here now? Again, our text, Colossians chapter 1, offers us help. At the first glance, it's so poetic. In fact, commentators say this is probably an early Christian hymn. At first glance, it's so poetic, we might miss its claim on us. But listen again to what verse 16 says. Verse 16 says, "For by him all things were created, things in heaven, things on earth, visible things, invisible things, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him." By him, he's the source, he's the originator, he's the prologue of our story, and for him, he is the goal, he's the destination, he's the final chapter of our story. It's what I like to call totalizing relevance. When it comes to the story of which we find ourselves a part, he stands at both ends. He's the agent at the beginning of the story, and he is the purpose on the final page of our stories. At least that's what the Bible is claiming. So, if we're to take the Bible at its word, that means that in order to embrace what we are here for, we have to first embrace his purposes for our lives, which, just like before, doesn't mean it's wooden or stifling at all. In fact, to the contrary, finding our calling within the grand scope of Christ's purposes is invigorating, it's empowering, and, you guessed it, deeply hopeful. So Paul goes on to say, or at least hint at why this is when he says in verse 18 that Christ is the firstborn from among the dead. He's talking about Jesus' resurrection. Jesus' defeat of death means that all of a sudden the unimaginable is now possible. It means that the seemingly hopeless is not necessarily, in fact, hopeless. At the end of Paul's longest chapter about Jesus' resurrection, which, let's just be clear, the Bible insists was actually a bodily resurrection, not something sort of vaguely spiritual or notional. At the end of that chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says essentially, when you're doing hard things that are aligned with the purposes of Christ, do not give up. Always, he says, give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, meaning that whatever you're doing that is aligned with God's purposes in the world, don't give up because you know that your labor is not in vain. It's not in vain because death has been overcome. It's not wasted because there's light on the other side of those drawn bedroom curtains. It's not lost because God has already demonstrated in Christ's death and resurrection his wholesale commitment to renovating and restoring the world. What he created, he will restore. And we're going to get to that in a moment. We must tuck that hope deep down in our souls, friends. We must remind one another of it. When you are 42 hours into Zoom and it's only Thursday morning and you've been fighting to make it so your students even have a device to connect on, let alone retain the lessons you're trying to teach them, hold on to this hope. Your labor is not in vain. When your lifestyle influencers are sipping Chianti and Tuscany and you've got instead spit up on your collar and you're reading Bible stories to your books or to your kids, and that devolves into tears and tantrums, maybe your tantrums, maybe devolves into Chianti, but remember, your labor is not in vain. When you're battling your addiction, tooth and nail, and you're tempted just to let go, just to give up, just to throw in the towel, don't give up. Your labor is not in vain. You were made by Him. You were made for Him. Your life and your purpose are in Him. Being a community of hope at St. Mo's means embracing God's purposes for our lives. It means your lives have meaning. Your work has meaning. Your relationships have meaning. One of the lifestyle influencers that I follow, a man who's shaping my desires to become a national wildlife photographer, he shared a sobering message recently. He said something to the effect of, California is burning in record wildfires. Colorado is seeing historic fires 2 days before a blizzard. Utah has a 100-year windstorm, and all of that is on top of a global pandemic that has taken over 900,000 lives, and on top of entrenched racial injustice in our country and others around the world. And while none of that was news to me, I just wanted to sigh, or better yet, just groan. And interestingly enough, that's one of the words that Paul uses in a different letter in the New Testament to capture the pain and turmoil of all of creation. Groaning. All is not right in the world, and it hasn't ever been in recorded history. The Bible's ringing assertion is that God knows that, and God cares about that, and He has set about a grand renewal project towards making things right, which the Bible also points out is overwhelmingly generous of God precisely because the problems don't have their root in Him or in the natural world, but their root is in us, in me, in you, in humans, the little visible representatives. But our bent from the very beginning of history, as the Scriptures recorded again, has been to resist God's loving and rightful leadership over our lives, and to wrong each other out of selfishness and spite, and to wring from the earth all we can, caring next to nothing for its rest or recuperation, to recoil even from ourselves within ourselves because we've lost touch of who we were made to be. The earth is and has been groaning because of this multi-dimensional alienation and fragmentation that's rooted in our sin against God. So our text climaxes with the proclamation that we have hope precisely because Christ, that's God in the flesh, precisely because He has taken it upon Himself to reconcile the alienated, to unite the fragmented. So listen to how Paul puts it, beginning in verse 19. He says, "For God was pleased to have all His fullness dwell in Him," that's Jesus, "and through Him to reconcile to Himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through His blood shed on the cross." Once, he says, you were alienated from God and you were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now He has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in His sight, without blemish and free from accusation. A crazy move, right? Audacious, loving. We were moving away from God in alienation, and God moved toward us in reconciliation. He came among us as one of us. He died in our place, on our behalf, on the cross, so that mysteriously our guilt, our guilt for rebelling against God and for our violence against each other and against the natural world is erased. It's just scrubbed. It's deleted. It's gone for good when we trust in Jesus. Trust in Jesus. You say, what do you mean by that, Ian? At St. Mo's, we often say trusting in Jesus means to lean the weight of your life on Him. Yes, it is cognitive affirmation. It's assenting in your mind that He lived, that He died in a way that applies to your life, and that He was in fact resurrected bodily. But it's more than simple mental assent. Leaning the weight of your life on Him means that, however imperfectly, you begin to live out of that new reconciled reality rather than out of rebellion. It means that His way of being human becomes our perfect model for being human. It means His story becomes the great narrative that gives meaning to our lives. It means your work, whatever your work is, cleaning bathrooms, a C-suite office, Zoom teaching, whatever your work is, it becomes meaningful within the grand scope of His reconciling and renewing project. And it means that immediately you have a new, non-biological family that looks like the faces on this Zoom screen, and millions more around the world, brown and black and Asian and Latinx and white and bald and bearded. It means that God sends also His Spirit to live inside of you, to put, as it were, God's life within God's little image. And that Holy Spirit then empowers us both to change over time, to become more and more like Jesus, and we'll talk about that in a subsequent week, but also it empowers us to join Him in His great work of reconciliation in the world. I don't know where you are on this journey, all of you, but to me, that is the most deeply hopeful news I could hear in a moment like this. That in Jesus, God has made it possible for us both to be reconciled to Him and to the rest of creation. If you've been tracking with me through this text, you'll have noticed that each one of our points in this teaching text, Paul brings the focus back to Jesus. He is the true image of the invisible God. He is the one in whom we find our purpose. He's the one who brings rescue into our broken world with His own loving sacrifice and resurrection. So at St. Mo's, when we say that hope is one of our core values, we're intending to do that same thing, to bring again and again and again the focus back to Jesus. We're saying that all of our hopes for our own salvation, for the salvation of Baltimore, for the rescue of the world, all of our hopes are pinned on Him. Not in a wooden or a narrow sense that means that we just sit on our hands and stare at a crucifix and wait to see what happens, but in the robust, invigorating, imagination-captivating, life-orienting sense that means that ultimately only the Maker is capable of being the restorer. So we throw ourselves eagerly into obeying Him, following Him, and cooperating with Him because we hope in Him. At the top end, I said that our core values, in addition to being kind of guideposts for us, they pin down what we're desiring to become, but they also are check marks for us. They enable us to assess our progress. So this core value says that if you're part of St. Mo's, you're going to hear about Jesus unapologetically, hopefully winsomely, but unreservedly. We're going to talk about Jesus. It means that if you're a part of this church and everything seems to be going swimmingly, but we're not pointing to Jesus, if that happens, if we're not regularly holding Jesus out as our singular hope, then we've drifted. We have lost sight of our purpose in this church. So joining St. Mo's means that you are getting on that train. It doesn't mean that we're all wired or gifted to be street preachers or evangelists, but it does mean that we are committed to using whatever abilities and resources and opportunities God puts in our hands to share this hope that we have, even in really simple relational ways, like inviting your friends to Alpha. St. Mose, this is our hope. Our hope is that God has come into the world as a human being to die for us, to be raised again for us. And he puts his Spirit into those who trust in him. He gathers us into a new family, and he invites us to come along with him towards the completion of his great renovating project in all of creation. That is the most hopeful story I think you're going to come across. It's certainly the most hopeful that I have come across, and I believe it's true.